Do you think you know how to fight when the enemy outnumbers you 3-1 and ammunition is running low? Imagine this. July 25th, 1944, Fonte Plateau, Guam. In the pitch-black tropical gloom, 3,200 Japanese soldiers, like shadows, advanced silently through the jungle surrounding the exhausted Marines of the 3rd Division. The Americans had been fighting for days, their ammunition dwindling and their nerves frayed from continuous combat. Reports poured into Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wenzel's radio station from scattered positions. His men were stretched across the plateau, vulnerable and exposed. Every military manual stated the same thing. When outnumbered 3-1 and surrounded, you dig in and pray for reinforcements. But the Japanese seemed to have done their homework. They knew exactly where the Marines slept. They knew which positions were the weakest. They knew the Americans had nowhere to run. When Lieutenant General Takashi gave the final signal to attack, he was confident he was delivering a decisive blow that would forever crush American resistance on Guam. But the Japanese made one fatal error, underestimating what happens when you corner a United States Marine. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, don't forget to tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The first Japanese artillery shell pierced the humid night silence at 03:00, its whistle cutting through the air like a blade. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Wenzel pressed his face into the muddy earth of his command post, feeling the ground shake beneath him as the explosion ripped through the jungle 50 yards away. The counterattack had begun exactly as his intelligence reports predicted, but its ferocious intensity surpassed all estimates prepared by his staff. The radio crackled with static as reports flooded in from across Fonte Plateau. The 3rd Battalion was under heavy mortar fire from the north. The 2nd Battalion reported muzzle flashes moving through the trees to the east. The hospital complex near Asen Point was already under small arms fire from Japanese infiltrators who had somehow breached the outer perimeter. Wenzel grabbed the handset and began issuing orders with the calm precision that had earned him the respect of every Marine under his command. He had been through Bougainville and knew that panic in the initial minutes of an assault could collapse an entire defense faster than enemy bullets. Captain Frank Bibb's voice broke through the radio static from his position on the eastern slope of the plateau. His 3rd Battalion was being hit by what sounded like an entire regiment of Japanese infantry, supported by knee mortars and machine guns that had been pre-positioned during daylight hours. The enemy had spent weeks studying American defensive patterns, identifying every foxhole, every supply route, every weak point in the Marine perimeter. They were executing a textbook encirclement designed to cut off American units from their command structure and destroy them piecemeal before dawn. But Lieutenant General Takashi made his calculations based on European warfare tactics, where encircled forces typically surrendered or retreated when facing superior numbers. He failed to account for a fundamental difference in how American Marines reacted to being cornered. As waves of Japanese assault crashed against the outer defensive positions, something unexpected began to happen. Instead of falling back or requesting permission to withdraw, individual Marine units began to dig in harder and fight with increased intensity. Private First Class James O'Connor crouched in his foxhole on the southeastern edge of the perimeter, watching tracer rounds streak through the darkness like angry fireflies. He had been in combat for exactly 11 days since landing on Guam, and this was the first time he had seen enemy soldiers moving in organized formations, rather than the desperate, isolated attacks of the previous week. Through his rifle sights, he could make out Japanese infantry advancing in 3 distinct waves, each larger than the last. The sight should have terrified him, but instead he felt something entirely different, a cold, focused fury that seemed to sharpen his vision and steady his hands. The Japanese had positioned their heaviest weapons to primarily target American artillery positions, understanding that U.S. defensive doctrine relied heavily on coordinated fire support. But Wenzel had anticipated this tactic and redeployed his howitzers the previous afternoon, moving them to secondary positions that were not marked on any captured American map. As enemy mortars began to fall on empty gun pits, Marine artillery crews were already preparing their response from camouflaged positions 800 yards away. Master Sergeant William Hayes coordinated the counterfire with the methodical precision of a man who had been dropping artillery shells on enemy positions since Guadalcanal. His forward observers relayed coordinates over encrypted radio channels, while Japanese infiltrators desperately searched for the source of the devastating American fire support. The 100 Miller howitzers began their work at 0345. Each shell was meticulously aimed at muzzle flashes and movement patterns that betrayed enemy positions. The Japanese committed almost their entire reserve to this single assault, believing that one overwhelming night attack would break American morale and force a general retreat to the beaches. Intelligence reports had convinced Takashi that the Marines were exhausted, undersupplied, and psychologically broken by 2 weeks of continuous fighting. What his staff failed to understand was that American units under extreme pressure did not break and run. They consolidated, adapted, and became exponentially more dangerous. At 04 Yash, the first wave of Japanese infantry reached the outer wire of the Marine defensive perimeter. They advanced through terrain that military doctrine considered impassable for organized units, using jungle trails and ravines not present on American tactical maps. The assault was intended to achieve complete tactical surprise, overwhelming the scattered Marine positions before a coordinated resistance could be organized. Instead, the Japanese found themselves marching into meticulously prepared fields of fire that had been registered and tested during the previous week. In an era of unprecedented information overload, where viewer attention has become the most valuable resource, many content creators face an invisible enemy, relentless audience churn in the very first seconds. Statistics are unforgiving. A significant portion of potential viewers abandon platforms like deserters, barely starting to watch. This problem undoubtedly prompts the question, what's happening? How do I stop it? Is this happening to me? Oh, just as experienced commanders analyze the battlefield to identify enemy weaknesses, we observe common mistakes that, like incorrect tactical decisions, lead to mission failure. Creators often underestimate the critical importance of their content's first moments, as if assuming the viewer will wait for the main action to unfold. This is a misconception comparable to assuming the enemy won't exploit an open breach in defenses. We, however, have developed a strategy that allows not just to retain the viewer's position, but to transform it into an impregnable fortress of attention, where every element of the script works for maximum engagement. This analytical review will present three key strategic techniques, the application of which will allow any script to capture and hold viewer attention from the first seconds, significantly increasing retention rates. And here's the first one: ready for immediate deployment. Many content creators may not even realize they are making a critical mistake in every video, methodically undermining their own audience. It's like an invisible sniper who flawlessly targets potential subscribers. Conventional approaches to video introductions often turn out to be tactical misconceptions, leading to an inevitable loss of attention. Forget all the boilerplate advice you've been given about introductions. Most of it, upon closer inspection, is ineffective and even harmful. The viewer's brain, accustomed to instant stimulation, demands an immediate answer to the question, "Why is this happening? Explain." Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. Your feedback is our strategic resource. How do you create this instant capture? The first technique is forming a curiosity gap, or, as it's also called, a mystery. This isn't just a question. It's a strategically constructed statement that ignites an intense desire in the viewer to know what happens next. For example, you could state, "You're making this mistake in every video, but you don't even notice it." This creates immediate dissonance, forcing the brain to actively seek an answer. The second strategic technique we'll examine is playing on the viewer's pain. This isn't about shocking the audience, but about emphasizing that the creator themselves was once in the same position, faced the same difficulties, but successfully overcame them. This establishes a deep emotional connection, creating a sense of trust and commonality. The viewer subconsciously asks, "If they could do it, can I? How?" This, like a pinpoint strike on an enemy's vulnerability, paves the way for further engagement. And finally, the third, no less important element, is justifying expectations. From the first seconds of the video, it's essential to clearly define the value the viewer will receive. Not abstract promises, but concrete benefits. For example, a direct statement: "In this video are 3 techniques that will make your design visually more expensive, and here's the first one." This, in essence, is a guarantee that the viewer's time will not be wasted, and it provides a solid foundation for continued viewing. So, we've covered the introduction designed to maximize retention. But what happens next? Once the initial impulse is captured, this is where the concept we can characterize as the infinite hook comes into play. It's not just a sequence of separate blocks of information, but a single, continuous narrative, where each segment of the video contains a subtle yet powerful hint of the next. The viewer should not feel where one topic ends and another begins. For them, it's a cohesive, captivating story. Like the coordinated actions of units on a battlefield, where one movement seamlessly transitions into another, all parts of the video exist as an inseparable whole. The introduction imperceptibly gives way to a new hook, which leads to the next, and so on, until the very end. All internal divisions into blocks exist only on paper for the author's convenience, but for the viewer, it's just an engaging narrative that prevents distraction. After 30 seconds, when the viewer is already deeply immersed in the content, it's time to reinforce the connection. So, stay with us and watch until the end, because we would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, don't forget to tell us in the comments where you are observing this strategic analysis from. Your geography is valuable intelligence for our team. When night falls and the enemy seems to surge forward unstoppably, what can instantly change the course of a battle? Have you ever wondered how to stand firm when all odds are against you and the enemy outnumbers and outmaneuvers you? The history of the Pacific Campaign knows such a moment, which occurred on Guam, where American Marines faced a massive night attack by Japanese forces. What happened next became a true lesson in military strategy, demonstrating how advanced technology and tactics can crush even the fiercest offensive. In this video, we will examine in detail how, in just 6 hours of darkness, the strategic balance of power on Guam was decisively shifted, and the Japanese forces, which began the night with overwhelming numerical superiority, were scattered and demoralized. We will show how a seemingly hopeless situation turned into a complete rout of the enemy. And here is the first key element of this incredible victory. Captain Bibb, receiving reports from his forward observers, learned that Japanese supply columns had begun retreating from the forward positions they had occupied during the night assault. The enemy's ammunition expenditure in the first 5 hours of fighting was colossal, and Japanese logistical capabilities proved insufficient to sustain the intensity of combat required by their offensive plan. More importantly, intercepted radio traffic revealed that Japanese commanders were beginning to lose contact with many of their subordinate units, as American artillery systematically destroyed enemy command posts and communication assets. This factor became the first nail in the coffin of their offensive. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us, the viewer, where you're watching from in the comments. The technological advantages developed by American forces over 2 years of Pacific battles proved decisive in ways neither side had fully anticipated. Marine artillery crews employed advanced forward observer techniques and radio coordination procedures, allowing them to deliver precise fire within minutes of receiving target coordinates. Japanese forces, accustomed to fighting adversaries with limited artillery capabilities, found themselves under constant bombardment from guns they could neither locate nor counter. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a system that broke their accustomed tactics. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, tell us, the viewer, where you're watching from in the comments. At 06:45 hours, Wenzel authorized the deployment of M4 Sherman tanks, which, until that moment, had been held in reserve, not participating in the night fighting. 5 medium tanks moved along predetermined routes that had been cleared of obstacles during the previous week. Their 37mm guns and coaxial machine guns engaged Japanese positions at ranges unreachable by enemy infantry weapons. The tanks advanced slowly through the jungle, but their appearance dramatically altered the tactical balance of the battle. This was not just reinforcement, but a new element for which the Japanese were completely unprepared. Japanese anti-tank capabilities on Guam consisted primarily of individual soldiers carrying magnetic mines and satchel charges, weapons that required extremely close approach for effective deployment. The tanks operated in coordination with Marine infantry squads, who prevented enemy soldiers from getting within effective range. Their armor protection allowed them to advance into areas where unprotected infantry simply could not survive. Each Sherman carried enough ammunition to sustain combat for many hours of continuous fighting, providing constant fire support that Japanese forces had no means to neutralize. The psychological impact of the American armored vehicles proved as significant as their tactical effectiveness. Japanese soldiers, having endured hours of artillery and machine gun fire, suddenly faced combat platforms that seemed invulnerable to their available anti-tank measures. Reports from captured Japanese soldiers later indicated that many units began to lose cohesion as tank-supported Marine counterattacks developed across multiple sectors of the front. This was not just a failure, but a complete breakdown of the will to resist. By 07 hours, Lieutenant General Takashi was receiving reports that his assault forces had begun retreating from forward positions without authorization from higher command. Individual Japanese units were making independent decisions to withdraw as their tactical situation became untenable, a complete collapse of military discipline, indicating the definitive failure of the counteroffensive. The general had committed his entire strategic reserve to this single attack, and the collapse of coordinated resistance meant that organized Japanese defense of Guam was effectively over. Even in their wildest dreams, the Americans could not have imagined such a swift and complete rout. The hospital complex that Sergeant Matsuoka had attempted to seize remained securely in American hands. The veteran Japanese infiltrator lay dead in a drainage ditch 50 yards from his objective, killed by a 19-year-old Marine private who had been in combat for less than 2 weeks. Scattered equipment and the bodies of his sabotage team marked the furthest point of Japanese penetration into the American defensive perimeter. This was not merely the death of one soldier, but a symbol of the collapse of the entire, meticulously planned offensive. Captain Bibb established radio contact with his battalion commander and requested permission to pursue the retreating Japanese forces. But Wenzel ordered all Marine units to maintain their defensive positions until the full extent of the enemy's withdrawal could be determined. American casualties were surprisingly light given the intensity of the night assault, but ammunition expenditure had been enormous, and resupply operations were necessary before any major offensive actions could be undertaken. Strategic thinking demanded cold calculation, not emotion. The sun climbed higher over Fonte Plateau, illuminating a battlefield where the strategic balance of power on Guam had decisively shifted in 6 hours of darkness. Japanese forces, which had begun the night with overwhelming numerical superiority, were now scattered, demoralized and unable to launch another coordinated attack. The Marines, who had been surrounded and outnumbered, had not only survived, but had effectively destroyed Japanese offensive capabilities in a single battle. This was not merely a tactical success, but a complete change in the course of the campaign. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fonte Plateau as Lieutenant Colonel Wenzel surveyed the battlefield, transformed by 6 hours of desperate fighting. Japanese bodies lay strewn across the approaches to the Marine positions in patterns that revealed the tactical history of the failed assault. The enemy had thrown everything into this single attack and lost not only the battle but also their capacity for organized resistance anywhere else on Guam. Wenzel's radio operator relayed a message from division headquarters authorizing an immediate advance to secure the plateau and eliminate the remaining pockets of Japanese resistance. Private First Class O'Connor emerged from his foxhole near the hospital complex and began the grim task of counting enemy casualties in his sector. 17 Japanese soldiers had died attempting to breach the medical facility, including the infiltration specialist whose equipment and documents would provide valuable intelligence on enemy capabilities and intentions. The young Marine had fired his M1 Garand rifle 43 times during the night's battle, each shot aimed with the precision that months of training had ingrained into his muscle memory. He felt no satisfaction in killing, but understood that his actions had saved the lives of wounded Marines who would have died without medical attention. It was more than just doing his duty. It was saving lives. How do you turn a desperate defense into a decisive offense? Imagine a morning when a battlefield, recently drenched in blood and despair, suddenly reveals a completely different scene. On Guam, events unfolded that would forever change the course of the campaign, demonstrating that even the most resilient forces can break under pressure. You might think that after the night's fighting everything was clear, but the truth was hidden in details that we will now uncover, and it is far more complex than it might seem. Captain Bibb received orders to move his 3rd Battalion toward the high ground, which Japanese forces had abandoned during their chaotic retreat. The enemy's withdrawal was so hasty that valuable equipment and supplies, including artillery pieces that could have been used to defend the plateau if Japanese command had maintained better control over its units, were left behind. Marine reconnaissance teams would spend days cataloging the abandoned materials. However, the most significant discovery was the complete collapse of Japanese command and control capabilities, exposed by the failed assault. This was not merely a tactical defeat, but evidence of a profound systemic failure that portended further catastrophes. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, don't forget to tell us where you're watching from in the comments. M4 Sherman tanks, which had proven crucial in the final stages of the night battle, began their ascent up the slopes of Fonte Plateau at 0830. 5 medium tanks moved in a coordinated formation, their crews carefully scanning the terrain for anti-tank positions and prepared obstacles that could slow their advance. However, Japanese defensive preparations had been entirely focused on stopping American infantry attacks, leaving them vulnerable to armored vehicles. The rapid collapse of organized resistance meant that most anti-tank weapons had been abandoned or destroyed during the retreat. Lieutenant General Takashina established his final command post in a cave complex on the northern edge of the plateau, surrounded by scattered remnants of units that had been annihilated during the failed counteroffensive. His staff officers reported that the effective Japanese strength on Guam had dwindled to less than 1,000 combat-ready soldiers, most of whom were isolated in small groups without communication or coordination with higher command. The general realized that organized resistance was no longer possible, but Japanese military doctrine required him to continue fighting until death rather than surrender, condemning him to a tragic end. Stay with us and watch until the end. We'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, don't forget to tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Marine artillery crews began the systematic destruction of suspected Japanese positions throughout the plateau region, using coordinates provided by forward observers and aerial reconnaissance. 150 mm howitzers rained high explosive shells on the enemy with devastating accuracy, eliminating cave complexes and fortified positions that could shelter enemy forces, attempting to reorganize for continued resistance. Each artillery mission was meticulously planned to minimize civilian casualties while ensuring the complete destruction of Japanese military capabilities. By noon on July 27th, forward elements of the 21st Marine Regiment had reached positions overlooking the entire northern section of Guam. The tactical situation had completely reversed from the desperate defensive fighting of the previous night. American forces now controlled the high ground and possessed overwhelming superiority in artillery, armor, and air support. Japanese forces were reduced to small groups hiding in caves and jungles, incapable of coordinated action, and gradually being eliminated by systematic search and destroy operations, portending the swift end of organized resistance. A company encountered the largest remaining pocket of Japanese resistance at 14 Wow, when approximately 60 enemy soldiers attempted to establish a defensive position in a ravine that offered natural protection from American artillery. The battle lasted 45 minutes and demonstrated the fundamental tactical shifts that had occurred since the failed night assault. Japanese soldiers fought with desperate bravery, but they lacked the weapons, ammunition, and coordination needed to stop the advancing Marine units, supported by tanks and artillery. It was a clash of two worlds, where one relied on outdated doctrine and the other on superior technology and tactics. Lieutenant General Takashina's death occurred during this final battle when the Japanese commander attempted to lead a last desperate charge against American positions. Marine riflemen killed the general and his staff officers with accurate fire, eliminating Japanese leadership and effectively ending organized resistance in that sector. The death of the senior Japanese commander symbolized the complete collapse of the enemy's defensive capabilities and marked the beginning of the final phase of securing Guam, turning a new page in the island's history. Private First Class O'Connor participated in the advance that cleared the ravine where Takashina made his last stand. The young Marine had transformed from a frightened recruit into a combat veteran in less than 24 hours of intense fighting. His actions during the hospital defense earned recognition from his squad leader and demonstrated the transformation that combat experience produces in American soldiers surviving their first major battle. The confidence and tactical knowledge he gained would prove valuable during the remaining operations to secure the island, ensuring his survival and future successes. Marine engineers began clearing routes for supply vehicles and establishing communication lines that would support continued operations against scattered Japanese resistance across Guam. The logistical capabilities possessed by American forces gave them decisive advantages in prolonged combat. While Japanese soldiers were forced to forage for food and ammunition, Marine units regularly received everything necessary to maintain combat effectiveness for weeks or months of additional fighting, highlighting the colossal difference in resources and preparation. By 18 Wow on July 29th, organized Japanese resistance on Fonte Plateau had been completely eliminated. Marine patrols reported contact only with isolated individuals and small groups that posed no threat to American control of the strategic high ground. The battle, which began with Japanese forces encircling and outnumbering American defensive positions, concluded with the complete destruction of the enemy's offensive capabilities and the establishment of firm American control over Guam's most critical geographical features, ending one of the campaign's most dramatic episodes. Lieutenant Colonel Wells established his command post in the cave complex that Lieutenant General Takashina had used in his final hours, symbolically occupying the position from which Japanese resistance had been coordinated. The American victory was achieved through superior tactics, technology, and training, but most importantly, through the fighting spirit of individual Marines who refused to be defeated, regardless of the odds they faced. The 21st Marine Regiment demonstrated that American infantry units possessed capabilities that enemy commanders had fundamentally underestimated, a decisive factor in the outcome of the entire operation. There are moments in history when the very notion of defeat seems inevitable, when enemy forces vastly outnumber and prospects appear utterly hopeless. But what if we told you that it is precisely under such conditions, on the brink of despair, that the most incredible victories are born, rewriting the canons of military art? Imagine, surrounded, cut off from reinforcements, facing a furious assault that was supposed to wipe them off the face of the earth. How is this possible? Today we will delve into the events of one fateful night on Guam, revealing the 3 tactical maneuvers that transformed an inevitable fiasco into a triumph that forever changed the course of the Pacific Campaign. Forget everything you knew about numerical superiority and strategic planning. This story will show how courage and adaptability can defy all logic. This is not merely the chronicle of one battle. It is a lesson in how courage, tactical genius, and an unwavering will can change the course of events when all seemed lost. You will learn about 3 fundamental principles that allowed a handful of people not just to endure, but to crush an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. The first of these is the art of transforming an apparent encirclement into a deadly trap for the aggressor themselves. Stay with us and watch until the end, as we'd be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We're very interested to learn about our audience's geography. The story we are about to tell unfolded on Fonte Plateau, Guam, and its repercussions changed not only the outcome of that specific campaign, but also the entire strategy of the Pacific War. It became a vivid example of how meticulous error analysis and a readiness for innovation can turn the tide of any situation, even the most seemingly hopeless. Following that fateful night battle, one of the captains, having analyzed every detail of the engagement, presented extensive recommendations for tactical adjustments. His conclusions were unsparing, but vital. American defensive lines required immediate improvement in communication between adjacent units, as well as closer coordination with supporting artillery and armored vehicles. The success of Japanese infiltration attempts exposed an urgent need for strengthened anti-infiltration patrols and the development of more advanced early warning systems. But perhaps the most significant lesson was the realization that Marine units achieved peak effectiveness, not by blindly adhering to rigid plans, but when individual soldier initiative was encouraged. This discovery, incidentally, would become a cornerstone for future transformations, even impacting the island's infrastructure recovery. As soon as organized Japanese resistance on the island finally ceased, a large-scale reconstruction of Guam immediately began. Marine engineers and the valiant Seabees, U.S. Navy construction battalions, worked tirelessly, repairing the damage inflicted by weeks of fierce combat. The airfield, destined to become a crucial base for B-29 bombers heading toward the Japanese home islands was significantly expanded and modernized, incorporating lessons learned from previous Pacific campaigns. Local residents who had endured the occupation received essential medical aid and vital supplies, initiating the process of restoring civil administration under American control. These reconstruction efforts were a direct consequence of the leadership demonstrated on Fonte Plateau. Lieutenant Colonel Well, whose leadership proved decisive during the most critical period of the Guam campaign, received a well-deserved promotion to full colonel and an assignment to division headquarters. This was a recognition of his exceptional abilities. His bold tactical innovations and cool-headed decision-making under immense pressure averted a potential catastrophe, transforming a seemingly doomed defensive operation into a decisive victory. The methodologies he developed were subsequently integrated into Marine Corps doctrine and taught in military academies for decades after the war concluded. Such lessons also profoundly altered the enemy's strategic thinking. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Fonte Plateau echoed throughout the Pacific theater of operations. Japanese command realized with horror that the capabilities of American infantry far exceeded their most optimistic previous assessments. The complete annihilation of numerically superior enemy forces in a single engagement clearly demonstrated that traditional tactical approaches were utterly inadequate against an adversary who skillfully combined technological superiority with exceptional training and exemplary leadership. The analysis of events on Guam led to a radical revision of Japanese defensive planning for the remaining Pacific strongholds. This, in turn, affected the fates of many soldiers, such as Private O'Connor. Private First Class O'Connor was evacuated to a hospital in Hawaii for treatment of wounds that proved more serious than initially supposed. Nevertheless, he returned to duty 3 months later and participated in the assault on Iwo Jima. The experience of surviving his first major battle transformed him from a mere recruit into a hardened veteran whose skills and knowledge became invaluable in subsequent operations. His personal evolution mirrored the broader transformation of American military capabilities that occurred throughout the Pacific War. This transformation was evident not only in the fates of individual soldiers, but also in the overall casualty figures. The final casualty count revealed the true scale of what was achieved during 6 hours of desperate fighting. Japanese forces lost 3,200 soldiers killed, with fewer than 100 taken prisoner, and the remainder scattered across the island in small groups. American casualties totaled 197 killed and wounded. This ratio demonstrated not just tactical superiority, but fundamental differences in military effectiveness that would ultimately determine the outcome of the entire Pacific War. The Marines holding Fonte Plateau intuitively understood that they were part of something much larger than just a battle. The Marines who heroically held Fonte Plateau deeply understood that they were participating in an event of historical magnitude. However, the full significance of their feat only became apparent decades later when military historians meticulously analyzed the battle within the context of the broader operations in the Pacific theater. They proved that American infantry possessed capabilities that enemy commanders had completely underestimated, capabilities that subsequently proved decisive in every subsequent campaign of the war. This achievement laid the foundation for further strategic changes that soon manifested on Guam. 3 months after the Battle of Fonte Plateau, Colonel Well stood in the operations center of a newly constructed airbase, which now occupied the very ground where Japanese forces had launched their last desperate assault. A massive runway stretched across the area that only months earlier had been soaked in blood during 6 hours of brutal fighting. Now, B-29 Superfortress bombers taxied across the concrete surface, preparing for missions to bomb the Japanese mainland. The transformation of Guam from a contested battlefield into a strategic bomber base symbolized a broader shift in Pacific theater operations, made possible by the Marine victory. And not only strategic changes, but personal stories, like that of Corporal O'Connor, continued to unfold. Private First Class O'Connor, fully recovered from his wounds and promoted to corporal, now led a squad in the 4th Marine Division, actively preparing for the assault on Iwo Jima. His invaluable experience, gained during the night battle on Guam, earned him recognition as one of the most tactically astute junior commanders in his battalion. More importantly, it gave him the confidence and combat knowledge necessary to train new recruits who would face similar challenges in upcoming operations. The lessons he learned defending the hospital complex were now being passed on to young Marines, who carried these time-honed methodologies into the final campaigns of the Pacific War. These lessons, incidentally, were also being actively implemented at a higher level. The tactical innovations that proved decisively effective in the Battle of Fonte Plateau were actively integrated into Marine Corps doctrine through specialized training programs deployed at bases across the Pacific. Officers and senior NCOs who were direct participants in that battle served as instructors, sharing invaluable practical knowledge on defensive coordination, counter-infiltration methods, and the integrated use of artillery and armored support. Thus, the institutional memory of the Corps was enriched by combat experience that shaped military thinking for decades after the war concluded. These changes were visible not only in training classrooms, but also on the battlefields. One major, commanding a battalion, meticulously studied reports of recent operations that vividly demonstrated how widely the tactical lessons of Guam had been adopted. Marine units across the Pacific were now employing defensive methods emphasizing flexibility and aggressive responses to enemy attacks, rather than passive resistance from fixed positions. The psychological transformation that occurred during the night battle was replicated in training programs that taught Marines to view encirclement not as a prelude to defeat, but as a unique opportunity to annihilate enemy forces that had exposed themselves to concentrated fire. This was not merely a shift in tactics. It was a change in the very mentality of the combatant. Have you ever felt that despite all your efforts and meticulous planning, something fundamentally goes wrong, as if you're playing by old rules in a brand new game? This was the stunning realization that confronted the Japanese command after one of their most catastrophic operations in the Pacific. Their superior forces were literally wiped off the map overnight, even though everything seemed to have been meticulously calculated. What? How? Is this about me? Many might have thought so, watching their hopes crumble. Today we will tell the story of a battle that became a turning point, uncover its lessons, and show why even the most entrenched patterns of thinking sometimes need to be broken. Japanese military analysts, meticulously studying the reasons for the catastrophic failure of their counterattack on Guam, arrived at conclusions that fundamentally altered strategic planning for the remainder of the war. Intelligence reports demonstrated with terrifying clarity that the combat capabilities of American infantry had developed significantly beyond all previous estimates. Particular attention was paid not only to small unit leadership, but also to impeccable tactical coordination and the masterful integration of all types of supporting weaponry. The complete annihilation of numerically superior forces in a single engagement convincingly showed that traditional Japanese tactics were absolutely ineffective against an enemy who had managed to combine advanced technology with exceptional training and an unyielding fighting spirit. The strategic implications of the Battle of Fonte Plateau had a colossal impact on Japanese defensive preparations for Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and even the Japanese home islands themselves. Military commanders realized the harsh truth. Frontal assaults on well-prepared American positions would inevitably lead to catastrophic losses without yielding any tactical results. New defensive doctrines began to emphasize prolonged resistance from fortified positions, completely abandoning counter-offensive operations designed to push American forces back to their landing sites. The psychological shock of the defeat on Guam finally convinced Japanese strategists that their troops were no longer capable of achieving decisive victories over American infantry in open combat. This realization not only changed tactics, but also forced a re-evaluation of the role of every soldier and every wounded man from an entirely new perspective, which we will discuss next. Stay with us and watch until the end, as many more astonishing discoveries await. We would be especially grateful for a like and a subscription. And of course, let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We're very curious. Marines wounded during that night engagement and evacuated to hospitals in Hawaii and the continental United States inadvertently became living emissaries, testifying to the rapidly evolving capabilities of American ground forces. Their accounts of the battle, shared with medical personnel, high-ranking officials, and war correspondents, helped foster a deeper understanding that the Pacific War had entered an entirely new phase, characterized by undeniable American tactical and technological superiority. The transformation of young recruits into hardened veterans in just one night of fierce fighting vividly demonstrated the exceptional effectiveness of Marine Corps training programs and leadership development systems. The technological advantages that proved decisive during the Battle of Fonte Plateau were now being actively replicated and refined throughout the Pacific theater of operations. But precisely how these innovations were changing the battlefield and what it meant for each soldier is what we will now examine. Radio communication systems, which allowed Marine units to flawlessly coordinate defensive fire and provide mutual support, were actively modernized. They received more powerful transmitters and significantly improved encryption capabilities. Artillery methods, practiced and perfected during that fateful battle, were standardized and integrated into the training of crews supporting operations from the Philippines to the Central Pacific. Procedures for coordination between tanks and infantry were honed and perfected based on invaluable experience gained during the successful defense against Japanese infiltration attacks. These innovations not only saved lives, but also shaped a new era of military strategy, in which not only technology but also brilliant minds, such as Colonel Well, whose influence extended far beyond a single battle, played a key role. Colonel Well received an assignment to the Pacific Fleet staff, where his exceptional tactical experience was immediately applied to planning operations in the final phase of the war against Japan. His in-depth analysis of the Guam battle had a decisive influence on strategic thinking regarding amphibious assault methods and defensive operations in future theaters of war. The institutional knowledge he acquired during 6 hours of desperate fighting was now scaled and applied to campaigns that would involve hundreds of thousands of American servicemen and ultimately decide the outcome of the entire Pacific War. But not only military aspects underwent changes. The very land where these battles took place also changed, becoming a symbol of rebirth and a new order. The reconstruction of Guam proceeded at an astonishing pace, transforming the island from a devastated battlefield into a major military base capable of supporting strategic bomber operations against Japan. The civilian population, who had endured the Japanese occupation, was immediately provided with medical aid, food, and housing. And while civil administration was restored under American governance, the contrast between brutal Japanese occupation policies and massive American reconstruction efforts served as a powerful demonstration of the vastly different values and capabilities represented by the warring parties in the Pacific conflict. In this whirlwind of change, as entire islands transformed their appearance, the stories of individuals became particularly vivid testaments to courage and transformation, such as the story of Private First Class O'Connor. The commendation for Private First Class O'Connor, awarded the Bronze Star, was solemnly read at a ceremony attended by Marines who had fought alongside him during the hospital defense. However, the true significance of his actions extended far beyond personal recognition. His transformation from a frightened recruit into a confident combat leader became a vivid symbol of the transformation the Marine Corps effected in thousands of young Americans who never even imagined they possessed the courage and capabilities necessary for sustained combat. This culture, capable of so quickly turning ordinary people into heroes, could not help but spark interest and study. The institutional culture that spawned such rapid development of combat effectiveness was meticulously studied and adopted by military organizations throughout Allied nations. The final phase of clearing operations on Guam revealed the full extent of Japanese losses from the failed counterattack. Burial teams, working under the supervision of Marine engineers and naval medical personnel, processed the remains of 3,200 enemy soldiers, ensuring dignified burial despite the circumstances of their deaths. The respect shown to fallen enemies reflected the high professional standards that distinguished American military operations and contributed to subsequent reconciliation between former adversaries in the post-war period. But even such noble actions could not conceal the fact that the Japanese command made critical errors, despite the information they possessed. Intelligence gathered from captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed the detailed planning that preceded the Japanese assault on Fonte Plateau. Enemy commanders possessed accurate information about American defensive positions, troop strength, and tactical procedures. Yet, they were completely unprepared for the combat spirit and tactical flexibility that Marine units demonstrated during that decisive engagement. The failure of such a meticulously planned operation provided invaluable insights into the fundamental differences between American and Japanese military cultures and their relative effectiveness in extreme combat conditions. Ultimately, this defeat became the cornerstone for the creation of a symbol of American power, erected directly on the battlefield. The airfield that now stretched across Fonte Plateau became a living symbol of American industrial and military might, enabling bombing operations that directly contributed to Japan's final surrender. Crews of B-29 strategic bombers, preparing for sorties to the Japanese mainland, drove past memorials marking the sites where Marines gave their lives defending the land that now proved vital to the Allied victory in the Pacific. The transformation of a contested battlefield into a strategic asset vividly demonstrated the broader trajectory of the war and the decisive nature of the tactical victory achieved during one night of desperate fighting. This story, full of drama and incredible lessons, is forever etched in the annals of great conflicts, reminding us of the cost of victory and the strength of the human spirit.